Hello, 7 people who watch these videos out of the 100 students in the class. I didn't realize how intimate these video sessions would be, but it is my job. And these are as much for me as they are for you at this point, because I feel like if I don't do these videos, what the fuck is the point of any of this for you? Like, you're paying for an education. I mean, but only like 10 of you are watching these, and I love all 10 of you dearly, and I thank you for that. And our little extra credit, secret extra credit uh, game I get is a lot of fun. I love watching you try to use the words organically in your comments. I'm you may think I'm easily amused. You are correct. I am. Um, so today we're going to talk about Scrubs, and Scrubs is such a good show that kind of gets lost in the wash of the early 2000s. I think it started in '01. And this episode that we watched for class was from the third season, I think. I have my DVD right there, the complete third season. Yeah, third season. And if you're right, it's an apt way to finish our little gender week, starting with Simpsons and then going to Who's the Boss and then Scrubs. Sort of more of a contemporary point of view on gender, and it's really, some of you mentioned in your comments, it's kind of a precursor to the Me Too movement, and a lot of this gender equality movement that we're experiencing right now that is long overdue. Thomas mentioned in his comment, right? The treatment of Dr. Cox is sort of an examination of toxic masculinity before that was even a thing, right? I mean, it's always been a thing. There have always been raging douchebags, but the term itself really didn't exist until more recently. So Scrubs ran for like 8 seasons, and then they did a weird 9th season with like a new cast, and then they did a reboot. Yeah, it got, as you know, most American TV sitcoms, go through this process of becoming really shitty. But it was pretty strong for a while. And like Who's the Boss, if you watched that video or were in class on last Wednesday, like Who's the Boss, this is sort of a contemporary look into gender where each character kind of occupies a specific position within this discussion. So Scrubs challenges preconceived notions of gender roles through each character and his or her relationship with other characters, right? This episode that I showed you with the whole Dr. Miller thing is you know, I mean, specifically made for this purpose, because Dr. Miller, I don't think Dr. Miller appears again. Like, I don't think she comes back for a like 3 or 4 episode arc. I don't think so. I think it was this episode, and then she was gone. Um, but you have uh, all these different um, sort of sensibilities um, coming into contact with each other in different and interesting ways. And I think uh, they use every character. So you look at the principal cast, right? Dr. Cox is the alpha male. He's the toxic masculinity spokesperson. He's everything male, right? Um, JD represents this sort of beta male, right? He's very sensitive, in touch with his feelings. He wants to, he seeks the approval of Dr. Cox. So they're always playing off of each other. And Cox is constantly feminizing JD. And, there's all those kinds of things. So JD, Zach Braff's character, he represents sort of this more feminized man. Turk is kind of in between, right? Turk's kind of in between. If we're doing the spectrum thing, you know how we like to do that. Dr. Elliot Reed is Sarah Chalke's character. She's blonde doctor to Dr. Cox. And she kind of represents this more stereotypical femininity, right? She's obsessed with what people think of her. She's obsessed with how she looks, and she's kind of an airhead, kind of ditzy. So she's that stereotype, right? And Todd is sort of this. He's just a fucking meathead. But as the series goes on, his sexuality is kind of up for debate, right? And that there's the joke where he's listening to Annie with his dad on the park bench, the flashback, that he points to a lot of his toxic masculinity is just a cover for his latent homosexuality. So there's all kinds of things going on. Dr. Kelso, the old doctor, he represents this, this generational approach to gender and sexuality, which is men are men and women are women, and that whole archaic bullshit that older generations kind of slide by with. And Carla, right? She's the nurse, but she is at once the fiery Latinx character, but in her relationship with Turk, she wears the pants. He even says it. Like, she wears the pants. Like, so she has more. She has more authority as a woman, and so they show all these different struggles through these different lenses, and the show's built that way. That's that's at the core of every episode, are these dynamics, and how do we explore them. This episode in particular has some additional ones. Jordan, who is Dr. Cox's baby mama, they're not married. They kind of hate each other because she has like, even in this episode, you see a shift. Jordan is very stoic. Her brother has died. Ben is her brother. She's very stoic. She's not emotive. She's very masculine in the way she reacts to this. And Perry is drowning his sorrows and pouting and crying and like a woman, quote unquote, right? So constantly sort of like reinforcing and challenging the stereotypes and our preconceived notions of them. with every interaction and every relationship. And of course, there's JD and Turk's relationship, which is the most heralded of all of them. I'm pretty sure they were responsible for the creation of the term bromance, which I don't think existed before them. They were certainly embodied that. And with that came these assumptions that JD and Turk were gay and conflating of gender and sexuality, which we know is stupid and we shouldn't be doing that. But yet, if you look at their relationship, there's nothing sexual about it, right? It all has to do with gender choices that kind of make us feel dirty about it. So there's a lot going on, and then this episode they take it up a notch by inserting Dr. Miller, the head surgeon who's visiting the hospital, and her sort of extreme feminism, I suppose. Like she seems to be the most evolved character. Yeah, who comes in to sort of shuffle the deck and get everybody sort of squared away moving forward. That's how I kind of look at it. Um, and I'll get to your comments in a minute because there's some interesting things that you guys had to say. So you see a lot in this episode, specifically. I mentioned the Dr. Cox and Jordan's reactions to the death of her brother, right? He takes it like a woman, and she takes it more like a man, which again does nothing more than to call attention to how ridiculous masculine and feminine distinctions are in the first place. They are arbitrary, they are irrelevant, and they should be eradicated. Uh, and but they cross gender representations there. That sort of fucks with our heads when we're seeing it. The whole There's also the generational thing that Kelso represents, right? That flashback to like the 70s where he's just like slapping ass and calling people honey and sweetheart and like that very just sort of flippant sexism that was all the rage, right? That's how it was, quote unquote. Um, so they represent these different arguments that are sort of throw themselves into the mix. Um, so the whole generational perception of the battle of the sexes or the whatever it is represented by Kelso. And I made this point in class. It's interesting that all of this stuff is playing out against the backdrop of a medical facility. You know, you think of medicine, you think it's genderless. Like you take care of black, white, you know, gay, straight, male, female, whatever, the same way. It's supposed to be a sexless, genderless, racist environment. Raceless, sorry. It's not supposed to be a racist environment. Hospitals are supposed to be racist. I don't know if you guys knew that. Raceless, genderless, sexless environment. And it's, you know, so you see how that stuff, I think it's just an interesting choice to make this a show about gender. It's largely about gender. It's about a multitude of other things, and set it in this against the backdrop of medicine and a hospital. I think is worth noting at least. So all the relationships in this, you know, there's the Cox JD thing that runs the whole series. But JD putting in sexual harassment complaints about Cox, right, shows, and the way he's manhandled by Jordan's two friends kind of shows this the flip side of sexual harassment, right? That it's, yeah, men feel it too, not so forcefully or incessantly as women, but it's a thing. Um, and then the Turk and Carla relationship is always sort of playing with that. Like, is it emasculating for Turk? Like, there are a lot of times when Turk feels emasculated by Carla because she's so outspoken and authoritative, and um, she occupies that role in their relationship and takes charge or whatever, right? All that kind of stuff. And then the Dr. Miller and Dr. Reed, Elliot conversation is this sort of the two ends of this feminist spectrum. And we talked about this in class when we were talking about girls and Sex in the City. It's like Dr. Miller thinks that Dr. Reed is just as bad as, is just as bad for feminism as, that Todd is or Turk is, um, because she's holding it back, the movement, by playing the role of the 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 female doctor, and that idea that just being a female doctor isn't enough. Like, we're, there's so much more here we're fighting for. You can't be a female doctor and cry in the closet and care about what people think about. Like, it's it's the whole two steps forward, two steps back thing. Like, where are we? You're moving. Any steps I took forward, you've taken backward. That kind of thing. Um, so basically, what we talked about on Wednesday was this idea that it shows the the different kinds of sexual harassment, and it kind of breaks it down in individually. So you have the three, and they all, how they all look differently, um, and how you might not be able to maybe pick up on some more than others. So anyway, there's objectification, there's institutionalization, and there's infantilization. Like, these are three major forms of it. And objectification is the most obvious one. It's Todd. Like, the Todd represents objectification. It is purely physical, right? He's obsessed with slapping asses and doing, just sort of like offhand comments, and um, yeah, like overt sexism and objectification. That's one form it takes. Institutionalization is the Kelso one, the old doctor one, right? Where it's like it's it's built into these settings. The sexism is built into it, and we kind of we give it a pass because of that, right? It's always been this way, like that kind of thing. And Kelso represents that. And then infantilization is the word I used to describe basically Turk's thing, where he feels like the woman has to be protected and sort of infantilized in a way to make him feel better about what he's doing. So I think it does a really good job of establishing this three-pronged attack, and not just talking about, oh, it's bad to be sexist, and this is what it looks. The Todd is sort of what we think of, not necessarily Turk or Kelso. It's like, again, giving some breadth to the discussion, and I think it's really interesting the way they did that. Um, you know, going back to the Dr. Miller, Dr. Reed conversation, it's kind of like who's holding who back, right? Because I think an argument could be made, and this we've talked about this with feminism when we were doing Girls and Sex in the City and Roseanne and all that. Like who's holding who back? Like Miller thinks Reed is holding everybody back, women back, by being who she is. And I think some of the reaction in class was that Miller was the problem because she's kind of so combative and abrasive and defensive when it comes to all these things. And that question of, who's doing it right or who's holding who back um, is an important one, but I think the show at the end, by the end of the show, you're supposed to see that it's Elliot, Dr. Reed, who's holding them back. I think that's the assessment that the show is making, right? When Elliot says to Turk, like, I want to be her, like I wish I could be her, you know. Um, and this is to Abby's comment, and we talked about this in class. I remember, like, we had this exchange in class about Dr. Miller. Abby was kind of critical of Dr. Miller and her whole approach to the whole Turk thing. And Dr. Elliot, or Dr. Reed, like that whole thing. But I'm like, my response was, and I think you agreed, Abby, maybe not. For the purpose of the show, the functionality of this show about gender, Miller had to be, like, that was exaggeration to the point of realization. It was like, we have to make her sort of like very curt and abrasive and sort of combative, because it's this implication that, like, this is how it has to be for a while until we get equality. We can't make these compromises and be wishy-washy about it. And you have to nip these things in the bud. So the whole Turk thing, right? You're the worst kind of feminist, the one who thinks that I need to be saved, right? Like, you got to nip that in the bud. And she does that. She's like, don't do that. And I connected it to the whole Donald Glover thing that I think I definitely talked about in class on Friday, but I don't know if I did to the whole class. The whole Donald Glover was announced he was going to be Spider-Man. I'll just blast through this. He's announced that he was going to be, I think, the voice of Spider-Man in maybe the Spider-Verse, like whatever it was. It was an announcement of Donald Glover. It was going to be this black Spider-Man, basically. And of course, everyone in the fucking Marvel community shit their pants, or all the racists in the Marvel community shit their pants. And he said his Twitter was just filled with racist shit, N-bombs and just the ugly shit. And his response to that was, I that stuff doesn't bother me. The just sort of arbitrary racist stuff that's just, people don't know any better and they're just ignorant. That slides right off. But he's like, there's one comment that just, it sticks with me to this day. And it was from some guy. And he basically commented that that his problem with having a black Spider-Man was, it was impossible to conceive of a black teenager, of a black kid living in Queens with his aunt who's into science and who's smart enough to be Spider-Man. Like, that's the kind of sort of ingrained, institutionalized racism that is frightening and problematic. So I think this episode of Scrubs is sort of a turn on that sentiment, where the Todd isn't a threat. He's a fucking idiot. And it's a pain in the ass, but the bigger threat are the Turks of the world. Right? You can somehow rationalize the Todd stuff, but you can't rationalize the Turk stuff, where it's like it's so ingrained in Turk that he sees this woman, has to protect her and save her, and like that. I think that's something that this episode is sort of is pushing, or is at least poking at. I could be wrong. All she wants is respect. Like that's yeah. You don't have to save me. You don't have to objectify me. Just respect me for being the head surgeon. Like whatever, just my work. It has nothing to do with my gender. Um, Respect should have nothing to do with gender. That's literally, she says, all I want is your respect. Um, so, your comments, I liked what you guys brought to the table. Appreciate it always appreciate it. Cammy brought up um, this idea, at least it sparked an idea in me that none of this will work, right? With the sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Like, none of it's going to work until men understand. Like, until men understand it and elicit the change. Like, that's kind of what the whole seminar thing that Carla runs for the three violators, the three representations, or three of the representations, like that men need to be involved in this in a real way, not in a superficial, like, oh, yeah, sorry, you caught me, oh, yeah, not in that kind of way, in some sort of real way to elicit change. Like we're never gonna see it. Um, which ties in to Tessa's comment about how it's not a woman's job to teach men not how not to be fucking assholes, how not to be sexist, how not to, you know, just just objectify women, all those kinds of things. And Tessa, you're absolutely correct, but that doesn't like mean that. But men still need to be involved. They need to figure it out some way. It should be on us, men. I'm speaking for men in this case. And your analogy about rape, like the fact that we're not the fact that the the talking point is usually, oh well, you can't dress a certain way or else you'll get raped, should be the other way around. You shouldn't rape people, period. Like let's work on you know let's work on the cause, not necessarily the symptoms, right? Let's get to the bottom. Let's get to the root cause of all this bullshit, which is scumbag guys, basically. Let's teach them not to be that way. Or it doesn't seem like it should be hard, but let's work on that, right? So I liked that connection between those two comments. Um, Kelly talked about how it shows how far we've come right? That maybe this is the start of this larger conversation that we are now having about gender discrimination, sexual discrimination, like all those kinds of things, and assault and Me Too and Time's Up and all that kind of stuff. Like, this was 2000, this episode was 2003 ish. So you definitely see some of the seeds being planted. And that's a good thing. That I think it shows that we've progressed from this specific episode and the statements that it makes. Eric brought up the idea of how the characters, and I talked about it too, they sort of are put at opposite poles, basically, to work against each other and examine different issues about race and sexuality and gender and all this stuff, and how that's a great device for a sitcom, especially, but any a movie, a TV show, like anything used to implement that kind of those kinds of dynamics to explore these issues is a good thing. I mentioned Tessa. It's not the woman's job um, to teach men not to be assholes. I agree. Uh, Internalized patriarchal ideals was the turn of phrase that Tessa used that I liked. Let's see where that is. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like it is such an issue in the society that many men think they are not sexist simply because they do not outwardly degrade or harass women. Many of these men still have internalized patriarchal ideals. Institutionalized was the word I used. So, yeah, absolutely right. Um, I mentioned Abby's problem with Dr. Miller, and we had that conversation in class, so I won't go any further than that. RJ, RJ, I liked the connection to 30 Rock and the famous Tracy Jordan quote about, white men keeping minorities and women in conflict while white dudes inject AIDS into our chicken nuggets. Yeah, the kind of this show works that way with its multi-race, multi-gender, multi-sexed characters. Kind of this episode specifically furthers that assessment of our patriarchal culture. And I mentioned Thomas citing this episode as an examination through Perry Cox, Dr. Cox, an examination of toxic masculinity before that term even existed. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for listening. At this point, I'm just doing extra credit words for my amusement because most of you who are getting them, like, there's only so much extra credit you can get. Like, you're gonna get an A, and among other things. So if you've done more than 2 of the extra credit secret words, you got the extra credit. Anyway, I'll do one just because I like watching your replies. Use the word embellish in your comment on this post and win the prize. Embellish.